RevOpsAF, the only podcast for people who are RevOpsAF and want to learn all about things that are RevOpsAF.
Our goal is to give the revenue operations community, that includes marketing, sales, and CS, for any of you not paying attention, the skills needed to accelerate their careers.
And RevOpsAF, the podcast, is brought to you by RevOps Co-op, a global community of operators from all across the globe. RevOps Co-op has membership options for everyone, including a free tier, and programs that meet you where you are, including a Slack group, peer-to-peer matching, weekly newsletters, digital events, in-person meetups, courses and education to help you level up your RevOps game, and more. Whether you're just getting started in revenue operations or have been leading teams for years, you'll find resources, connections, and real answers inside the community. Learn more and join today at RevOpsCoop.com. That's RevOpsCoop.com.
Welcome to RevOpsAF, the podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts, Camela Thompson, and today I'm joined by George Erskine. George, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm George. I've carved out a career in RevOps. I've been doing this for 15 years. Started RevOps when I was at Adobe, then I moved over to Solar City, and then since then I've been with a number of SaaS startups and have my own consulting business now for RevOps called Candescent Strategies. I'm excited to talk today because I've realized what I've learned just as much by mistakes as I have by doing things the right way. And so I'm here to share some of that wisdom.
Isn't that how everyone learns?
I wish it was just went perfect, but no, it's usually the stuff that doesn't go well.
Yeah, so speaking of imperfections and comp plans, I think intellectually a lot of us in revenue operations understand it's a combination of motivating through money and psychology. We're trying to get people to follow what the business wants them to do. But sometimes we forget that these are people's livelihoods that are tied to these plans. Give me an example of one time where you thought, oh yeah, this is somebody's livelihood.
Yeah, what you said echoes with me. I think comp is true economics in action. One of my favorite mentors early on when I got into RevOps told me, don't mess with people's money. You wouldn't want them doing that with yours, so don't do it with theirs. I agree. People respond to incentives. But the one that I learned from surprisingly was with the head of finance. It was an interim head of finance. I didn't make this mistake, but this person had decided to change the comp plan mid-year, which has a huge amount of gravity to it. But what he wanted to do was change the commission payment not to be on booking, but to be on when they received the payment from the customers. And that then took it out of the control of the sellers. They had much less control over that than the booking. He defended it and says, look, the T's and C's say right here, management reserves the right to change the program at any time. And I think the question was like, hey, how's that working out for you? It did not go well. It was perceived as completely disingenuous. There was no context provided to the team, and what happened was the number one seller did an end around. I didn't even know about it. He went to the board, and the board let it be known that it was not popular with them, and it didn't reflect well on that interim head of finance. And it was something I learned from somebody else's mistake. Don't do that. And certainly if it happened again, I would have had a stronger voice to walk through, roll the tape, so to speak, on what was that going to do. But it was a huge problem.
Wow. I mean, I've seen changes, but typically it's in response to an unrealistic number that the sales team was given, or there's been some kind of behavior that's just rampant that we want to curb by incentivizing the different product lines a little differently. So we're used to selling one thing, we're leaning really heavily into that, but the future of the company is going in a different direction. So I've seen it happen to varying degrees of success. I think my big aha moment was the sales leader told me that salespeople by nature usually mostly optimists, but there's a healthy level of paranoia in there to keep the deals moving along and checking in. That really came to light when we rolled out a change, and I had a salesperson call me up really angry saying, well, I knew they wanted me to quit. She hated the comp plan so much. And when I took more time with it, because I wasn't in charge of designing the comp plan, I'm like, oh, no wonder she thinks they want her.
She thought it was kind of like a quiet firing just by the way the comp plan was written.
Yeah. And the way she sold and what she sold, yeah, I could see that. It wasn't totally paranoia, so felt bad for the gal.
Hopefully it worked out. Hopefully it worked out in the end.
But going back to the example of having to adjust because of unrealistic targets being set by the board, we take the board's number, we divide it by all the salespeople. What's a better way to approach that? Maybe we start there.
Yeah, I mean, I've had that happen where it's usually a tops-down number. I think that's always a great start, and it's something that you shouldn't wait to just do once a year. You should be checking in with, like, what's that tops-down desired number from the board every quarter, and see how you're tracking to that. But it's our job in RevOps to build a great capacity model, or what people might understand is like, do you have enough horsepower to hit that? And there's a lot that goes into calculate. How do you calculate horsepower for your organization? So I love hearing that as a baseline, but that example you said of just like, let's just take the number of sellers and, divide that number we want by the number of sellers. And typically it's the ones you have now. And it almost always translates to, we raise their quotas to get that. And that's another example. I've actually seen it more than once happen. And one time I didn't speak out enough to say, you can't just raise quotas to get yourself to where you want to go. But there was one where I was successful enough where it was the CFO, in fact, who was saying, hey, we're going to raise quotas. They were, I think, around $1 million each for the sellers. And we're going to raise it another $200K to close the gap. And I was able to show that in a prior year when he'd done that with just one or two type sellers, it had led to somebody quitting over it. And so when you have a good capacity model, you can show, hey, model out. If you raise quotas, you have to change your assumption around attrition, because some of your better sellers are actually going to move on if they feel like they can make less money under the new plan for the same amount of performance. And you also have to consider that you've got people who might be close to being on a performance plan, that if you raise that quota, they're going to get on that plan and you're going to have to let them go. And so when you adjust the attrition factor in your capacity model, you realize you were far better to have kept the quota the same size and have less attrition than to have to deal with that turnover. It means you just don't have enough horsepower to hit the number. And that's a lesson I've seen really hard to learn by a lot of people. And so it requires RevOps to be able to stand up with a model and numerically explain to the CFO why the different scenarios don't play out. Don't raise quotas unless you can demonstrate that there's something different and quantifiable that's going to let them achieve more this year. Maybe it's some big product change or some market change, or it could be some amazing enablement program you've driven, but something that needs to be really clear that you can spend the same amount of calories as you did last year, but you're going to do 20% better this year. And if you can't explain that, you can't expect the team to rally behind a higher quota.
Yeah, and I'm sure most of us listening are nodding along with me because we've seen that. I had a sales VP who is just determined to own planning and compensation modeling. Mm-hmm. And they were very much of the school where you get the number from the board, you divide it by the people. He prided himself on being a debate person. So what I had to do every time is come up with a legal case, mm-hmm. airtight, on why this wasn't going to work. And at the time, we had 20% of our sellers making up for 80% of the number. Gotcha. The markets weren't changing. The ramp time was ridiculous. I kept saying, you need to lower it for everyone, and you need to plan on hiring more people and an enablement person to get everybody on, like, find what's repeatable, scale it across the team, is not sustainable to have that 20% carry the weight, because they're going to burn out, they're going to leave, they're going to make more money elsewhere. How do you see that bottoms up model? How do you best sell that across the company? And I know you mentioned working with finance. Do you show them your homework? How do you get that collaboration with the finance team?
Yeah, I think that one, you need to, I'm listening to what you said. The experience I've had is you need to break it into chunks, and you have to make sure your head of sales or your CRO buys into the model. Same thing with the CFO. And you got to bring them both to the table in a meeting and say, hey, this is the model we're going to use. Maybe it's RevOps owns the model, maybe finance does, but you agree on what that model of record is. And then you talk about what are the basic assumptions and the areas where that model is most sensitive to, and do we all agree on that? Like, what are our assumptions that are going to drive productivity? And it may mean you have to have a couple conversations just with your head of sales to educate them on how these models work and the sensitivity. One thing I've said often that works is, hey, by that rationale, if they're telling you something that doesn't have any rationale to it, you can say, by that rationale, how would this work? And you kind of show them, like, hey, show me in this model how those numbers will work. Oftentimes they will kind of come around and realize, all right, I'm wishful thinking here. Then you tell them, here's how it could work. If we invested here, or if we hired more of these roles, we could get more quota. But use that model and then make sure that the CFO and CRO are seeing eye to eye on the assumptions and the baseline. My example was a little bit different than yours. What I found was, like, my CROs are typically a little bit more hedging. Like, they don't want to sign up to an aggressive a number as, say, the CFO. And you've got to kind of bring both sides to the table and ground them in numbers and say, here's our baseline assumption for productivity, for attrition, and for ramp time. Those are the things that are most sensitive inputs to your capacity model. Like, how quickly new reps get ramped into their role, how productive are they to their quota, or how efficient are they, and then overall, like, attrition, like, what's your turnover like? And if you can get a great basic understanding on those things, it's a good start.
Yeah, I agree. He's unusually optimistic. I think you're right in that usually people are just really hesitant to sign people up for an aggressive number. But what I also see, particularly with finance, is they're very protective of cash flow and try to backload the new hires into the later parts of the year rather than accounting for ramp and that sort of thing. How do you recommend working with finance to really talk them through, no, we're going to have to hire them earlier than you think because we need to hit this number, and in order to do so, blah, blah, blah?
Yeah, the hiring timing is really key. As a common rule of thumb, I try to target it for January 1st. And so it requires a lot of you have to reverse timeline and say, what does your recruiting team need to be able to figure out when they're going to hire those people so that you get that capacity? Because the capacity models usually work that oftentimes people, like sellers in their first quarter, they either don't have a quota at all, or they assume like 25% their normal productivity. If you hire them in the last quarter of the year, they're not producing anything. So if the CFO or finance team wants to do that, they know that they're playing the float and they're essentially investing for next year's number, not this year's. And hiring, if you think about logistically, is also very tough to do during a holiday quarter. So when you think about like the human factors, the capacity that the recruiting team and the hiring team has, making finance kind of sit in that reality, and then also look at the model and say, you could move mountains and do all this, and still it's not going to have much of an impact on this number. That's when they can like start to respond and understand, okay, I see what your rationale is, why you're sequencing these certain hires. You've thought through like your actual physical capacity of like your enablement team to onboard people and the recruiting team to source them and get them on board. And that's why, yeah, it's a lot of detail and sometimes it can be painful, but walking them through the details of that model and just seeing the scenarios, if we did this is what happens to productivity. This is what our deployed quota would be under this scenario versus another. that's a way of getting them on board.
I so agree with you, because I've had so much success sitting down, walking through the logic and the math with the finance team, even to get buy-in on attribution, which is really hard to do, as we all know.
And coming back to a point I made a few minutes ago is sometimes people have they think like either like they might think about conversion rates or pipeline, things that are going to happen. There's actually a number of factors in a capacity model. There can be like 10 or 12 different things, but really focus them on the things that matter. And almost always it is those three factors of like, your hire date, when they get hired, how quickly they ramp into their role, and then what's your turnover. Turnover has a huge impact on capacity. And therefore from that you can extrapolate overall productivity and efficiency. Everything else is kind of like, the models are not very sensitive. Like if you play with one, you can say, what happens if I raise my quota 20%? It really doesn't impact, because of those different factors. It doesn't get you out of your capacity gap. So if you can just keep them focused on the simple things that the model's really sensitive to, at least you get 80% of the way there.
Yeah, totally agree. And I found it's also really powerful. So, okay, if we are to hire an enablement person and that knocks a month and a half off ramp time, what does that do to the model? Can help.
Yeah, you make a good point there. Like oftentimes in RevOps, we know we need something. Maybe now is the time to get a director of enablement. That's a good point. I use those capacity models as the basis of justifying, saying, right now, other things equal, this is our capacity. And they'll say, well, you got to do more. The board's saying you got to do more. Okay, this is how we can do more. One of those could be enablement. If we hire a director of enablement, and maybe that's got $250,000 of overall cost to it when you add payroll and benefits and things like that. But we can actually raise our capacity because of that, because we're reducing our ramp time and we're increasing the productivity of the existing reps. Maybe that increases like productivity for $700K for the year. So you've just justified doing that. So it's a good way you can speak the numbers of finance and justify like the team growth that you want. But yeah, unless you can kind of demonstrate that, it makes it hard to justify a hire, and it certainly makes it hard to justify raising your number or expectations that you're going to perform any better.
It's also a great tool to test your hypotheses and go back and validate. Our enablement hire, we actually knocked 3 months off ramp. That's huge, and that's what we're going to get out of it.
And those capacity models are awesome because you might have one that you've done in Excel, and that might suit you just fine. But the one thing you want from all of these is being able to run scenario plannings. What happens if we do this? What happens if we hire this person? What happens if this product gets launched early or if this one gets launched late? And that's why there are a number of tools out there now that are more automated tools. They can tie right into your CRM and let you do real-time capacity modeling and scenario planning for just these types of things.
So let's circle back to demotivators. I know we talked about setting the bar too high for quota. One interesting one I'll call out before I kick it over to you on other things you've seen people do that can really stall selling and cause some, unease with the sales team. One that I thought was really interesting, we had a big delay in rolling out compensation plans for the year. And instead of operating on the theory that, our products haven't changed, we're probably going to make more money if we sell more and get started now, we had several sellers refuse to do anything until they had the compensation plan in their hands, and it really threw us off for Q1. What other kind of missteps have you seen really throw off team morale?
Yeah, that's why it's so important to roll out your plans. If you have a sales kickoff, say at the end of January, comp plans need to get rolled out then. And it's really important to make sure they're signed off. Because, I live in California, people should know that if you don't have a plan signed off and there's some debate, the law always falls back on what's the most recent signed plan. So if it's last year's plan, people won't necessarily drive a lot of action and urgency until they know how they're paid. And it might seem counterintuitive to some, but that's just the reality of it. There's been a number of like, hey, yeah, like when they find out the way the plan works, it might be demotivating for them. And so if they're not getting their plan till 3 months, 4 months into the year, and then they find there's some measure in there that seems totally disingenuous to them, I've seen it create almost to the point of like mutiny with the sales team. And that's why not just getting the plans out on time is important, but socializing them beforehand, certainly with their management, like here's what we're going to be doing, is super important. And if you're on a calendar year, that stuff happens in like October and November. So I can think of a number of examples that were perceived as like disingenuous or weren't received well, but not think of anything like really specific right now other than...
Oh, I'll throw a couple softballs.
Yeah, you tell me a couple screw-ups you had.
Clawbacks.
Clawbacks.
That's one that's really hard to justify and do well. I'll give you this scenario. We are seeing early attrition from customers, like refusing first invoice because they felt like they were sold something different than what the onboarding team was trying to implement. There was no coordination between the two teams. So what we did is we switched commission recognition from at time of booking to at time of revenue recognized.
Mm-hmm.
It was explained fairly well. The management team wasn't totally on board on the sales side, and that can ruin the best made plans. Have you seen similar scenarios? How have you navigated that?
The only time I've seen where I could advocate a clawback is maybe something like you have a provision in your T's and C's that says when you leave the company, your final commissions will be paid upon collections or something. But in general, like clawbacks happen if somebody cancels their contract, right? Or maybe doesn't pay. And then you're essentially making the seller suffer for that. They are not going to make their commissions until that clawback has been paid off, right? And it's really simple. Like we paid you, but then the company's not getting paid, so we're going to withhold it from future commissions. That's not, well received when people can't, meet their monthly expenses and things like that. So in general, you need to invest time as RevOps working with finance to say, well, what is it about our processes that means we need clawbacks? Maybe there's something wrong with our accounts receivable process and the way we go about collections. Maybe we need to make it standard that things are annual contracts and that we have better quality credit checks in place. These are all finance processes, not seller processes. And sellers should not be involved in it. And so I work to patch those gaps so that we know, yes, there's a 5% risk of collections here, but based on our financial metrics like days sales outstanding and others, we've built in enough structure and checks in there that we don't have to put that on the sellers in terms of clawbacks. We can take the risk on, in finance and in RevOps with our processes and be able to take a small amount of risk and not put that on the seller. Because anytime anybody has a clawback, I know it's a huge demotivator. I've even seen people I saw a seller leave once because they knew they were not going to be able to make any more commissions for another 6 months. They didn't have to pay the clawback back if they left the company. So it was an easy decision for them to go work for somebody else if they weren't going to make any money there.
And in this case, what ended up happening is we did some research and tied a lot of these early cancellations back to really unusual payment terms and invoicing conditions that were approved during the contracting process.
And then who approves those? Finance, right.
So we had to sit with them and say, would you rather have a tough conversation with the board by missing the number by a little bit? Or would you rather go to the board later on and say, well, that number we reported, turns out it wasn't right. So we ended up changing some behaviors and really cutting down on the number of strange exceptions that signaled they probably weren't good for the money.
Yeah. And I hope I'm not sounding like I'm like, hey, this is all finance. Finance has a job to preserve the interests of the company, cash flow, and things like that. But that's where RevOps can play a huge role is like, hey, let's talk about the psychology of this, what this actually means to a seller, and therefore what it means to capacity, and then let's come up with a better way of doing this.
And I've seen RevOps help in other aspects too, where it's, hey, these legal conditions are always questioned. Can we work with legal to maybe standardize them more or change what we're doing here? Or these approval tiers having to go through every step of the management change. If the top person approves it, why do we have to have everybody else? Like, there's a lot of ways we can reduce friction, I think, on the RevOps side. Would you agree?
Yeah, and I think too, RevOps, it's also in the way you position it. Like, for instance, RevOps could represent finance's interest and go to the team and say, you know what, we're driving towards annual contracts, even now multi-year deals too. And so if you achieve those, there's no clawback provision. But if you are going to, we're not saying we won't do a month to month, but if we do, understand, then there is this provision or something. So that people know, like, hey, it's within their control how they negotiate with the customer, how they steer the conversation, that if there's one of these provisions that might not be as popular, they understand that they had the power to change it by the way they sold the deal. The other one is decelerators. You ever use decelerators?
No, but
where
I've seen accelerators kind of have the same impact almost, where they felt like they were getting cut down from what they used to get to 100% a quota, and then they were making up for it if they went over. So that always caused a lot of unease as well.
Yeah, no, it's this one, and this is where you have like an accelerator means you get paid a nominal commission rate. Maybe it's 10 or 15% on the deal. And then once you've hit your quota, you get paid a higher rate. But decelerators might mean you get paid only 5% until you close a certain amount of business. Then you get paid 10, then you get paid accelerators. The problem with that, first off, is really hard to understand how much you make. And two, it can be really disappointing if you close a really good deal as a seller and you get hardly paid on commission. And then someone's explaining, oh, I'll make up for it at the end of the year. People just don't respond well to that. No. You want commissions to be easily able to understand the $100,000 of business I close. This is how much I get in commissions. It's like, should be able to, really easy to say that, and decelerators make that difficult. I did have a CRO that once said, hey, I heard of this program where sellers have to pay their base salary first before they get commissions, and then their accelerators are much richer. He thought, like, people should think about it as like, this is hugely motivating for me to get to quota. But that's not how people saw it. They're like, you're telling me I really won't get paid commissions until I cover my base cost? And that takes me like 7 or 8 months into the year. Anybody who's realizing like their paycheck fluctuates so much through the year, like I'm going to make all my money at the end of the year and then I'm not going to make much take-home pay at the beginning, that flopped horribly.
Oh, yeah.
Created problems.
I think people need to realize that they're relying on making the OTE. Like, that, it's not the base salary that they're counting on and planning their finances around. Like, it's just not how they think about it. Wow. So tons of great advice. I know the right answer, especially as a consultant, is always, it depends. But do you have any best practice or final thoughts you'd like to leave people with as they grapple with thinking about next year's commissions plans?
Yeah, I think that just on a personal level, spend some time with yourself and say, hey, what are your basic principles? And fight for those, right? Fight for those with data and numbers. And if you're challenged, reach out to a mentor or somebody who's also done this and say, I know that we're about to make a mistake here, and get some guidance. But remember, like, my basic principles, people are motivated by incentives. It's like that classic economic thing. So if you're trying to change something with your business, like strategically, like we want to move towards more expansion than new business, make sure your comp plans adjust with that. Don't mess with people's money. People become economists when it comes to their comp plans. And we hire sellers because they're good at selling value and ROI. They're good with numbers. They're clearly going to understand their own plan, and don't think that they won't. Another principle I have is know that you can admit to your own mistakes. If you've probably got 5 different comp plans at least. You got account managers, CS, account executives, SDRs, things like that. At least one of those is going to have a problem that you're going to have to course correct through the year. And you don't want it to be where you're coming like that example I said, where that head of finance said, hey, something that helps the company. The company might have to eat some cost to make things right. And so really line up on that. Like, we will always do things to make things right. Maybe it's to a particular individual or to a team. And so figure out a structured way to review that with finance and, make corrections in the year. Also know that everybody talks to everybody about what they make. You're remiss if you think that they don't. And so when people find out that, this person makes this much in commissions for closing the same amount of business I do and I make much less, that's a recipe for disaster. And then another principle is your CFO should be happy to write every commission check. And if you ever hear grumbling, you need to talk to them and find out why. But that's advice I got from my first CFO. Like, I'm happy to write these checks, even if it means that a rep might be making $1 million a year. If they're involved with you in the way you design the plans and you do things right, you should be happy to have certain reps who are doing very, very well financially, because it means you've architected the business right. So, I've heard things like, it's easy to say like sellers are coin operated and like little trite comments like that. It's not. These are your peers and they're very smart people and they've got a very high risk job. Half their income is at risk. And in RevOps, we have a bonus component usually, but we don't take that risk. Most people in the company don't take that risk. So really remember that and treat it tenderly, because if you don't, then they're going to see you as part of the problem, not the solution. And comp is one of those areas where if you get a reputation of being fair and explain it well, sellers line up behind you. And that means they will line up behind you when you're asking them to do different things with CRM or take on a different methodology. But if you screw it up with their comp plan, then, you're not making friends.
I mean, that's fantastic career advice in general. Aligning with your values and arguing with what you feel is right. Owning your mistakes quickly and loudly. I've never gotten in trouble for that, and I've made plenty of mistakes. And it helps you gain trust across the board. People see you as an advocate for them, an internal seller on their behalf, and that you're honest and you'll do the right things. So those things never hurt. George, thank you so much for being on the show and sharing your knowledge. Where can people find you online to network and learn more about your consultancy?
Sure, I'd love to connect with anybody who wants to reach out. I'm on LinkedIn, George Erskine, Erskine, and I'm also, you can email me, George at candescentstrategies.com. I'd love to connect with anybody, share more advice. If you got a question on commissions or other RevOps things, I'm happy to at least share what I know has worked for me and what I've screwed up and not to repeat.
Thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode, everybody.
For more great content like this, join our community at RevOpsCoop.com and check out the links provided in the show notes.
Keep it RevOpsAF, y'all.